So what makes a horror movie a horror movie? So I have an article pulled up in front of me just defining horror. So first of all, it might surprise some of our audience to know that horror has really existed as long as fiction has existed, right? Like there's horror tropes going back as early as ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So pre-BC, it's just one of these genres that is inherent in humanity. Like we're naturally afraid. We naturally want to get those emotions out. We like to be scared on some level.
I'm sure even cave drawings told horror stories.
There's no doubt in my mind, especially, I mean, at that point, it was more of a survival thing, right? Like,
and maybe that's the reason why horror exists, because there's always going to be stuff we don't know about that could be dangerous, or just danger that we do know about that we got to stay away from.
Well, I mean, we could talk about the psychology of horror for hours on end. Like,
psychology.
Like, I'm sure there was some point in history where horror was sort of designed to frighten people. It was sort of designed to treat certain groups of people like outsiders. Like, the argument could be made that the Red Scare was just a horror tactic designed to freak people out about, like, commies, you know?
What about religion? If you don't follow the teachings, you're gonna be damned. You're gonna go to a place of eternal torture where your soul will never recover from.
Well, that's what the Salem witch trials were all about, wasn't it?
Yeah, but, well, that was about black. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I've actually was listening to this other podcast recently about the Salem witch trials, and some of it made it seem like a lot of the accusations were politically motivated, or more so just because people really didn't want to adjust to each other moving in and getting in close proximity. I don't know. There was a whole kind of thing that went on where it really had nothing to do with religion at that point. It was just people trying to place blame on others because they couldn't get along.
So, I mean, that's the thing. I was actually just in Salem, I want to say a month and a half ago. It was probably I want to say middle of September, maybe.
My one friend who's in Boston right now, or he's near Boston, he said, what was it? I think it was just last weekend. He actually went and visited Salem, and he said there's people dressed in costumes all over there. And I said, what's wrong with these heathens? Let the souls rest.
Well, there's people like dressed as witches like any point of the year. Like, again, I was there a couple months ago, well before October, well before Halloween time, and there were still people like dressed as witches. It's just part of the aesthetic there, you know?
It's a pretty grim thing to be known for.
But the truth is that witch hunts and, like, the whole idea of the witch as presented in Salem has always been a metaphor for outsiders. It's always been a sort of scare tactic. It's always been an outsider sort of mentality. And you're absolutely right when you say that part of the reason why the Salem witch trials gained traction was as a means of, like, you know, political motivations. It was as a means of sort of detracting and getting rid of political opponents, or not even political opponents.
Something we might be seeing today, according to some people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's the argument, not to get too political, but, you know, Trump uses the term witch hunt all the time. Yeah, exactly. I was just going to draw it back to how you were saying, you know, horror's always been a thing and probably always will be, and so will, you know, this sort of thing. This sort of phenomenon. Yeah. So how do we define horror as a genre?
It's spooky. Spooky stuff.
Yeah, basically. But so here's the Wikipedia definition, because I took the 5 minutes of time we dedicate to research to look up some Wikipedia articles.
Yes, extensive research.
Horror is a genre of speculative fiction, which is intended to frighten, scare, disgust, or startle its readers by inducing feelings of horror and terror. Literary historian J.A. Cudden defined the horror story as a piece of fiction in prose of variable length, which shocks or even frightens the reader, or perhaps induces a feeling of repulsion or loathing. It creates an eerie and frightening atmosphere. Horror is frequently supernatural, though it might be also non-supernatural. That's a given. Often, the central menace of a work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for the larger fears of a society. So it's all stuff we talked about in the last few minutes. You know, horror is such a wide umbrella. It's used to really discuss a variety of topics. Personally, and you'll see this with my lists, I think the best sort of horror is the most realistic horror. It's the horror that anything that could be real could be turned against you. It's horror in reality. That's what truly frightens me.
Personally, I think from seeing the news every day, like if you watch New York City news or probably any big city news, it's like a horror show every single day. Who's getting killed? Who's getting beaten? Who's getting stolen from? What's the next crisis? The building's burning. The sewer rats are coming out all over the place. There's always some horror story that they lead with because they want you to watch. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, in that regard, realistic horror is around us every day. Every day, there's probably something horrible you can think of that could possibly happen. I walk outside, a tree could fall on my head and crush me.
Yep. Well, I mean, and it just goes to elaborate. I could get bitten by a
rat with rabies.
It just goes to elaborate on how realistically fear generates emotion in people. Like how quick we are to react to something that scares us than we are to react to something that makes us happy or something that makes us joyful. Mm-hmm. Fear is just one of these emotions that's universal, that we're always entranced by, that psychologists have spent literally their entire existence trying to ponder and trying to get to the root of.
Now, on the flip side of that, the kind of horror I prefer is the kind of horror of things that kind of transcend our ability to understand, like cosmic horror or existential horror, things that like you just would have no chance against. It's just that beyond us as puny mortals.
Right. I sort of get that. Like just limiting our place in the universe, right? Like
just making us seem so small and insignificant.
Yeah. No, that's pretty terrifying in and of itself.